This is World Solution Writing Process Podcast, episode 16. Okay, this episode is probably going to make some people who have known me laugh a lot. Or maybe cry, who knows? Because this episode is about revolutionary dictatorship and revolutionary authority. Topics on which I have myself altered my views dramatically in recent history. You could say it really was COVID that pushed me over the edge towards support, conditionally, and in certain contexts of revolutionary dictatorship. And also a bit more towards revolutionary authority, which is not to say that I've become some kind of hardline Stalinist or Maoist. What's really happened is I've come to appreciate Trotskyism as it actually is, not as it was initially taught to me, which is a very nuanced position, which supports a democratic form of socialism as the result of struggle, and fights to reinstate democracy, but accepts a rather dictatorial structure in the struggle for socialism. So I'm just going to jump into it. In the past, I've been trying to prepare my episodes a bit so that they would be a bit coherent, and then I'd also get to handle some of my nonlinear notes. But the truth is, I really need this as a writing process. I'm not going to be able to prepare every episode the way I have been able to do in the past. So, let's just dive into the notes. We should not necessarily reject recruiting the majority. If the majority can be recruited, this is excellent. The problem is that the majority usually has false consciousness under capitalist governance, and usually does not break this false consciousness until after one government replaces another, or in the middle of the process of replacement, and brings with it a host of changes in economic structure and changes of ideology of the media, schools, and courts. So there was a mini-series in 2017 called Trotsky, and it was pretty much just about Trotsky, and it really showed the trajectory of how he went from being an oppositionist, sort of in this position of an oppressed activist, and then became part of the leadership of the revolutionary organizations and the Soviet of Petrograd, as well as leading the October insurrection in terms of the technical details, crushing Kronstadt, and then finally turning out to be a campaigner for the restoration of democratic norms, and then being crushed for that. So it really shows the trajectory that needs to happen and the places where it can go wrong. But in that mini-series, in episode 1 of that mini-series from 2017 called Trotsky, someone said to Trotsky, and this was his jailer, who sort of taught him an important life lesson. He said, "You cannot decide people's fates and still be a human to them." This was about 22 minutes into the episode 1 of Trotsky. Anyway, more notes. The reason dictatorship must be transitional is because all dictatorships have a tendency to become their own form of class hierarchy based on state oligarchy or economic corruption, even if the dictatorship is initially established for liberatory ideological reasons. This is why many socialists contend that socialism needs democratic structures like workers' councils or political pluralism as its long-term structure, even if the dictatorship of individuals is accepted temporarily in order to bring this more democratic socialism about. So we should begin and end with multi-party socialism, but be prepared for an emerging fallback position of temporary revolutionary dictatorship precisely for the purpose of preparing democratic socialism, by establishing the necessary security situation, political stability, and economic coordination necessary for a stable multi-party socialist system to thrive. The trick of revolutionary dictatorship is caring about everyone while not caring what they think, in the name of the people's well-being without the people's input. Righteous authority. You may think it's preposterous to accept transitional minority rule as a valid possibility in Western countries. However, in the USA, the majority often does not vote. Even in the 2020 election, a record setter for voter turnout, less than half of the total US population voted, though about 2/3 of eligible voters voted, and this was unusually high. All Western democracies are in reality based on the minority rule of the wealthy. And finally, the revolutionary dictatorships of Cromwell, Robespierre, and Napoleon were the precise method by which European democracy was established. Spare the dictatorship, spoil the bourgeois. From the Wikipedia entry for Dictatorship of the Proletariat. There is a Dictatorship of the Proletariat Wikipedia entry. Isn't that nice? The Communist Party of the Philippines theorist and activist Jose Maria Sison describes the dictatorship of the proletariat as a, quote, socialist democracy for the proletariat and the other exploited classes, without which a proletarian state is incapable of securing democracy for the entire people. Sison writes, while dictatorship of the proletariat may sound terrifying to some and evoke images of indiscriminate acts of violence, It is a well-established principle of scientific socialism to remove the economic basis of class oppression and exploitation, and to give even the members of the erstwhile exploiting classes the amplest opportunity to remold themselves and contribute what they can to the progress of a socialist society. Under this conception, the dictatorship of the proletariat makes political allowances and respects legitimate interests of sections of the bourgeoisie which join the revolution because, quote, it has never occurred that the proletariat has ascended to power without allies, end quote. In contrast, quote, the coercive apparatuses of class dictatorship are applied on those who have no desire but to destroy or subvert the socialist society, end quote. Might as well talk about the term dictatorship of the proletariat. There's been a lot of discussion about this that, honestly, I think misses the point. So you have your typical Stalinist and Maoist tankies who pretty much equate single-party dictatorship with the dictatorship of the proletariat. Then you have anarchists and libertarian socialists and democratic socialists who either reject the term entirely or they apply it only in a very extremely liberal way, where Karl Marx said the Paris Commune is the dictatorship of the proletariat. But then again, the Paris Commune wasn't even really sufficiently socialist in terms of how much it transformed the economy. So there's a middle road where this concept of the dictatorship of individuals is valid, but not as a permanent or long-term feature, but as a temporary transitional feature, to be followed by something more like a multi-party socialism. There's a dialectic between democracy and dictatorship, where democracy is what we're fighting for, but dictatorship can be a transitional form in the revolutionary struggle. And I'll try to find the quotes that explain this below. Okay. This is Lenin from The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government, which you can read yourself on Marxist Internet Archive. Lenin argues both that the workers' councils were democratic, but also that capitalists were hypocritical in demanding no socialist dictators, since bourgeois democracy itself was founded by the revolutionary dictatorships of Cromwell, Robespierre, and Napoleon. Quote, that in the history of revolutionary movements, the dictatorship of individuals was very often the expression, the vehicle, the channel of the dictatorship of the revolutionary classes, has been shown by the irrefutable experience of history. Undoubtedly, the dictatorship of individuals was compatible with bourgeois democracy. On this point, however, the bourgeois denigrators of the Soviet system, as well as their petty bourgeois henchmen, always display sleight of hand. On the one hand, they declare the Soviet system to be something absurd, anarchistic, and savage, and carefully pass over in silence all our historical examples and theoretical arguments which prove that the Soviets are a higher form of democracy, and what is more, the beginning of a socialist form of democracy. On the other hand, they demand of us a higher democracy than bourgeois democracy and say, personal dictatorship is absolutely incompatible with your Bolshevik, not bourgeois but socialist, Soviet democracy. So Lenin advocated being tough on crime. Quote, all the elements of disintegration of the old society, which are inevitably very numerous and connected mainly with the petty bourgeoisie, because it is the petty bourgeoisie that every war and every crisis ruins and destroys first, are bound to reveal themselves during such a profound revolution. And these elements of disintegration cannot, quote, reveal themselves, unquote, other than in an increase of crime, hooliganism, corruption, profiteering, and outrages of every kind. To put these down requires time and requires an iron hand. There has not been a single great revolution in history in which the people did not instinctively realize this and did not show salutary firmness by shooting thieves on the spot. So paradoxically, the Bolsheviks were criminals as their way of rising to power in terms of bank robberies, but once in power, cracked down on crime. So Crane Britain, I'm trying to give you the good juicy quotes from people other than myself. Crane Britain, author of Anatomy of a Revolution, says, dictatorships and revolutions are inevitably closely associated because revolutions to a certain extent break down or at least weaken laws, customs, habits, beliefs, which bind men together in society. And when laws, customs, habits, belief tie men together insufficiently, force must be used to remedy that insufficiency. Also, this is just my notes, when the intensifying pace of events prioritizes actions over words, chain of command replaces deliberative democracy as necessary to prevail in the struggle. So there's a tempo to revolutions, and depending on what phase of the tempo you're in, events can be happening slowly or very quickly. When events are happening too quickly, there's no time to discuss them, and chain of command becomes necessary. More from Crane Britain. Though names like Cromwell, Robespierre, and Lenin stand out as those of rulers, and although these men did exercise unquestioned power in many ways, the characteristic form of this supreme authority is that of a committee. It's saying that many revolutionary dictators did not have the title of dictator. Instead, they were extremely influential individuals on a central committee, because these dictatorships emerged from movements that started out profoundly democratic and participatory. Revolutionary movements that demanded, the fall of a king or a monarch or a capitalist oligarchy. So, the way these revolutions begin is with parallel governments that take more the form of a legislature. But as the struggle intensifies, not in every case, but in some cases, these parallel governments are forced to resort to extreme authority. And though they may retain their form of legislatures, they have an executive committee, and someone emerges as the supreme executive on that executive committee, whether by having the title of leader of that committee or simply by being the best theorist or the best fighter on that committee. What Trotsky was up to in the Russian Civil War was very repressive. Trotsky described his time on his war train as one of continual scrambling. This is during the Russian Civil War, responding to this or that sudden urgency in the random chaos of warfare, in which improvisation won out over a systematic approach. It is precisely in conditions such as this in which the need for revolutionary dictatorship emerges, and it was precisely in the wartime situation of the Russian Civil War that the effective, if not formal, dictatorship of Lenin emerged, with Trotsky essentially in second place as vice dictator. So this is a quote from, The Train. It's literally just called The Train. It's chapter 34 of Trotsky's My Life, his autobiography. So, he says, of course, the actual material resources of the train were slight in comparison with the needs of the army, but they were constantly being replenished. But what is even more important, tens and hundreds of times they played the part of the shovelful of coal that is necessary at a particular moment to keep the fire from going out. A telegraph station was in operation on the train. We made our connections with Moscow by direct wire, and my deputy there, Skalansky, took down my demands for supplies urgently needed for the army, sometimes for a single division or even for a regiment. They were delivered with a dispatch that would have been absolutely impossible with my intervention. Dispatch means speed in old-timey talk. Of course, this is not exactly a proper way of doing things. A pedant would tell us that in the supply service, as in military departments in general, the most important thing is system. This is absolutely true. I am myself rather inclined to err on the side of pedantry. But the point is that we did not want to perish before we could build up a smoothly running system. That is why, especially in that early period, we had to substitute improvisations for a system, so that later on we might develop a system on their foundations. And, this is kind of reminiscent of Zelensky's continuous berserk orations to the West, demanding an ever-shifting list of military hardware. Which, whatever your geopolitics are, it is notable that both Trotsky and Zelensky are Ukrainian Jews who are fighting some reactionary Russian force. I find that interesting. They're certainly not completely comparable. There's certainly also significant differences between them. All right, so there are some points where I actually disagree with Lenin. Ooh, big scary. No one's ever allowed to disagree with Lenin. But there are some good quotes from immediate tasks of the Soviet government that sort of explain Lenin's way of thinking about how economic coordination to him justified a sort of dictatorial approach. He says, large-scale machine industry, which is precisely the material source, the productive source, the foundations of socialism, calls for absolute and strict unity of will, which directs the joint labors of hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of people. The technical, economic, and historical necessity of this is obvious, and all those who have thought about socialism have always regarded it as one of the conditions of socialism. But how can strict unity of will be ensured? By thousands subordinating their will to the will of one. And here's where I half agree, half disagree. We must subordinate to a single plan for industry to function. But that plan can be chosen democratically. It can be chosen by the workers. However, there is an interesting concept that you can have your deliberative period, but during actual activity, adherence to the plan is necessary, which I think is implied in this next quote from Lenin in the immediate tasks of the Soviet government. He says, and our whole task, the task of the Communist Party Bolsheviks, which is the class-conscious spokesman for the strivings of the exploited for emancipation, is to appreciate this change, to understand that it is necessary to stand at the head of the exhausted people who are wearily seeking a way out and lead them along the true path, along the path of labor discipline, along the path of coordinating the task of arguing at mass meetings about the conditions of work with the task of unquestionably obeying the will of the Soviet leader of the dictator during the work. And he talks about how, hey, didn't we just fight for freedom, from such authority. He acknowledges this and says the conditions of revolutionary crisis require it be reinstated. He says, unquestioning subordination to a single will is absolutely necessary for the success of processes organized on the pattern of large-scale machine industry. On the railways, it is twice and 3 times as necessary. In this transition from one political task to another, which on the surface is totally dissimilar to the first, lies the whole originality of the present situation. The revolution has only just smashed the oldest, strongest, and heaviest of fetters, to which the people submitted under duress. That was yesterday. Today, however, the same revolution demands, precisely in the interest of its development and consolidation, precisely in the interest of socialism, that the people unquestioningly obey the single will of the leaders of labor. Of course, such a transition cannot be made at one step. Clearly, it can only be achieved as a result of tremendous jolts, shocks, reversions to old ways, the enormous exertion of effort on the part of the proletarian vanguard, which is leading the people to the new ways. My notes say, we must struggle against the wavering in ourselves. At times, an author must get quite aggressive with the reader, or perhaps the podcaster with the listener. Fuck your bullshit. Yes, you. As first world scum, you have no decency. As the oppressed working class, you have no dignity. You have neither decency nor dignity, and this must end. You have a right and duty to rise. The paradox of revolution is that to achieve liberation, we must submit to discipline and organization. Progress requires structure. Multicellular organisms achieve their power through a specialization not present in the amorphousness of single-celled organisms. This was the Bonapartist principle of Napoleon's monarchy, sacrificing the democratic political form of the revolution, while still upholding and spreading many individual rights, an authoritarian structure for maximum effectiveness in upholding individual rights. Every revolutionary dictator has applied this principle, as well as every revolutionary who has forged a sufficiently disciplined organization to win a revolution. In What Is to Be Done, Lenin had this beautiful little quote, which I wish people when I was being recruited to Trotskyism had honestly been a bit more firm with me in teaching me these specific things. Reflect somewhat over the real meaning of the high-sounding phrases to which Robespierre Diallo gives utterance, and you will realize that broad democracy and party organization, amidst the gloom of the autocracy and the domination of the gendarmerie, is nothing more than a useless and harmful toy. It is a useless toy because, in point of fact, no revolutionary organization has ever practiced or could practice broad democracy, however much it may have desired to do so. It is a harmful toy because any attempt to practice the broad democratic principle will simply facilitate the work of the police, and carrying out large-scale raids will perpetuate the prevailing primitiveness and will divert the thoughts of the practical workers from the serious and pressing task of training themselves to become professional revolutionaries to that of drawing up detailed paper rules for election systems. Only abroad, where very often people with no opportunity for conducting really active work gather, could this playing out democracy develop here and there, especially in small groups. So, to be clear, I'm aware that in the Western world, you can have a socialist meeting without getting rounded up by the cops. Now, in China, you can't necessarily have an anti-government meeting without getting rounded up by the cops. But the thing is, the argument that Lenin is making here, in What Is to Be Done, actually still applies to even Western democratic conditions, perhaps for different reasons. He's saying that, in a condition of having to organize underground, you kind of just need a chain of command. You can't really base yourself, even if it's a, quote, non-military organization, it's still an underground organization, and therefore still needs a chain of command, because trying to, have like a democratic deliberation in an organization, that's, organizing in material conditions that are not democratic doesn't really work. And organizing in material conditions where this sort of democratic deliberation is intrinsically risky because it gathers too many people together. The point being, even in the democratic West, so-called democratic West, this principle still applies that Lenin is espousing, but for perhaps different reasons. And these different reasons are material conditions of artificial scarcity. So in material conditions of artificial scarcity, but also material conditions of false consciousness, the majority of people are affected by capitalist false consciousness. So to just throw open the doors of an organization and say, oh, everyone gets a vote, actually is a bad idea. Ideally, you don't even let everyone in. You only let in people who have the correct ideology to prevent this sort of liquidation and watering down of a revolutionary organization into the false consciousness of the majority. However, that's not the only problem. there is often false consciousness on strategic questions in the majority of people who have correct consciousness on broad economic and political questions, meaning the false consciousness of capitalism manifests in many ways. And in many ways, there's a strong connection between ignorance and false consciousness, where reformism is a form of false consciousness, where you have many people in the socialist movement basically are reformists. This is based on a false understanding of the legitimacy and the democratic character of capitalist legislatures. In fact, they are not democratic. They are oligarchies of the wealthy. But a lot of people don't understand that. They have false consciousness. So you need a sort of self-appointed top-down chain of command to preserve the correct political consciousness, not only from society at large, which has false consciousness on basic questions of capitalism versus socialism, but even to preserve the correct orientation against those who have false consciousness, which is the majority of socialists, on strategic questions. But furthermore, you also need a chain of command because in a situation of capitalism, you have artificial scarcity where the majority of people don't really have time to participate. They don't really have time to have true democratic practice. They are contending with survival. And in situations where, as discussed earlier, the tempo of events is fast, when you have a fast tempo of events, and in capitalism, the tempo is very fast, and they're always turning the tempo up in terms of production and exploitation and working you longer for less, the tempo is always going up, and you always have less and less time. So it becomes less and less important for there to be a vote on this or that, and more important for action to be taken, for a revolutionary government to be built, and for anti-government demonstrations to be organized, regardless of whether there's a vote on this or not. Better that it just happen, better that it get done, than it be sabotaged by all the chaotic arguments that come up when people actually try to vote on things under capitalism. Because, it's like we all have this drowning sensation of exhaustion. You expect us to be able to practice a mature democracy where we really listen to each other? No, it just ends up being, like Game of Thrones. It ends up being a power struggle, a faction struggle, and it's not productive. So it's actually better to have an authoritarian structure when going up against not even just, capitalist dictatorships like, the Tsar of 1917 in Russia, the monarchy, when going up against even bourgeois so-called democracy, because the conditions of artificial scarcity, of, the billionaires having all the profits from all the work we do and us scraping by, that doesn't create a condition for a healthy democracy, and it creates conditions where false consciousness also can water down a revolutionary organization. So in practice, the top-down sort of approach that Lenin was advocating and what is to be done, despite the conditions being different, other aspects of capitalist material conditions means that, in my opinion, his arguments still hold. The only other thing I'll say, and this is not from my notes, more just off the cuff, is the real issue is, can you have a majority revolution? And it's not that majority revolutions have never occurred. It's just that you shouldn't rely on it, because false consciousness is real. Like, for example, the American Revolution was not a majority revolution, even if it fought for the democratic rights of the majority. What it did in practice was carry out a three-way split in the population, where 1/3 of the population was for the revolution, 1/3 was against, and 1/3 was neutral. It's not just over questions of capitalism versus socialism that people have false consciousness. You had people defending the British Empire during the American Revolution. What kind of ridiculous false consciousness is that? But it's the false consciousness that they were raised with. And you may think, ideas don't matter, the masses have the same material interests. And they may. But the problem is that not all the masses are aware of their material interests. And you have this conflict of ideas that becomes a conflict between persons. Because you may think ideas aren't really material. People with different ideas, they can just change those. But think about all the Trump supporters who will fight to the death to defend capitalism, despite the fact that they're being oppressed by it. Think of all the people in the Russian Civil War who were on the side of the White Army, despite the fact that the White Army was this oppressive force that was trying to reinstate a monarchist-style system. If not through direct monarchy, then through military dictatorship. Not some kind of communist military dictatorship or socialist, like a very reactionary capitalist military dictatorship. No one had any business being a peasant soldier in the White Army, and yet there were so many. And you may say can't we win those people over? Well, kind of hard to do when they're shooting at you. So in practice, you do need minority rule at certain times. And it should be a transitional rather than permanent or even long-term feature. This is the real debate between Trotsky and Stalin. It's not really about dictatorship versus democracy per se. It's how is the dictatorship of the proletariat applied? Is the phase of dictatorship of individuals or dictatorship of single parties a phase that ought to be long-term or even permanent? I think most Stalinists would even say it's not supposed to be permanent. There is supposed to be some kind of devolution. I think they usually justify their sort of long-term party dictatorship and long-term individual dictatorship as a product of being besieged by global and Western imperialism. As I think the Trotskyists would say, the best way to fight that global imperialism is to have a system that's democratic and therefore involves the masses in the defense of that system, rather than it just being done on their behalf by some bureaucratic elite. The thing is, during the initial condition of revolutionary crisis, both sides of the Trotsky-Stalin divide, if you actually study real Trotskyism and not this like fake Trotskyism that they spoon feed to you in college or whatever, that both sides of the Trotsky-Stalin debate support individual or party dictatorship in practice during the revolutionary crisis. And it's the question of, after you have the insurrection and after you win the immediate civil war, if a civil war emerges, to defend the infant socialist republic from counter-revolutionary forces, then what do? Do you maintain the sort of iron rule, the authoritarian rule, which is the Stalinist/Maoist orientation, or do you devolve it back to something more like democratic socialism, which is the Trotskyist orientation? And it's interesting because I think a lot of people across the spectrum don't know the nuance of this position, that there is such a thing as a position which sort of dialectically balances revolutionary dictatorship and democratic socialism, and it's called Trotskyism. I think Bordiga might be on board with this, but then again, he's kind of hostile to democracy at times, so it's not so clear. Anyway, thank you for listening. This has definitely been a long journey through the dark, but there will be other episodes. I'm going to try to get back on my weekly rhythm, and have a nice day. Long live your revolutionary dictatorship, unless you're against me, in which case, down with your revolutionary dictatorship, and long live my revolutionary dictatorship. Nanny Nunu, signing off.